Hello and good morning, everyone. As I mentioned, my name is Alison. I'm the Education Manager with Forest Ontario. Welcome to this Ontario Envirothon webinar on species at risk. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Colin Casson. Colin is a field ecologist working at the interface of policy and plant ecology, invasion ecology, species at risk, ecological restoration, and other natural history-based topics. Colin works with the Invasive Species Centre as a policy manager and is the vice chair at the Ontario Turtle Conservation Centre. In this webinar, Colin will be discussing species at risk, including some of the policies and processes in place that guide species at risk protection and examples of community-led recovery action. Colin, if you wanted to take control of the screen and turn on your camera, you should be able to get started with your presentation.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Alison. Here we go. Here we are. Okay, let's get this show on the road. All right. Alison, jump in if I'm not sharing the right screen here, but I think we're good.
I can see your slide though, so you should be good.
Okay, right on. Okay, hi, good morning, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you for the nice introduction, Alison. As Alison said, my name is Colin Casson. I'm the policy manager of the ISC, and I wear a couple hats. My day job focuses on invasive species, which are a threat to species at risk. But when I take that hat off, I have a couple other more species at risk roles that kind of, I think, suit me well to chat with you about the topic today. So yeah, as Alison noted there, I'm the chair or vice chair of the Ontario Turtle Conservation Centre, which is meaning that we're going to talk a lot about turtles today, which unfortunately are species at risk. All of those species in Ontario, depending on if we're talking about federal or provincially regulated. They are indeed all species at risk, and a former member on the Species at Risk Program Advisory Committee, which I'll speak to a little bit later, but it's an organization that helps support government action on species at risk. So coming at it from a few different angles today, and it's a big topic. We'll kick it off with that kind of context set, is that we're talking about species at risk. It's hard to talk about them all without getting specific, and examples, drive interest. So I'm going to try and dive deep down, but if it seems like we're on a tangent on a species-specific point, hang in there. We'll start with, for the context for today, we'll start talking about some federal and provincial policy, which is, I won't spend too many slides on it, but it's an important underpinning for the whole discussion around what is a species at risk. So before we can talk about species-specific examples, which is really where the interest and fun lies for most people, we'll just kind of set the scene with a little bit of policy. So hang in there, and as Alison said, use the chat function, and Alison, please jump in at any point if you see them, because I'm too many screens on the go here to figure out how to monitor that one, but off we go. So let's talk about kind of Species at Risk 101, and the study guide which you've got is a fantastic resource here. So a lot of this resource, a lot of this information on background is coming out of there, but we're talking about species at risk. We can talk about any taxa of species. We could talk about plants, animals, some of the more cryptic species tend to be listed in here as well. And we're talking about our species that are at risk of becoming extirpated, endangered, threatened, or special concern. So there's different kind of categories and statuses which are outlined nicely in this diagram here. And so when I'm talking about species today, I'll try to refer into where do they stand on this category. I think most of the species we're talking about today are either threatened or endangered. So it's a helpful bit of context, but just generally it's kind of a pathway from one box to another. So for a little bit of context, as of 2020, there are 622 wildlife species at risk in Canada. So again, we're talking all taxa from obscure aquatic plants that you'd only find if you went snorkeling, all the way up to the smallest of insects that perhaps only hang out in the upper canopy of a tree, and everything in between. So, as I said before, there's going to be a couple little notes on policy. So what I wanted to do is just speak to where do we stand nationally and federally in terms of policy related to species at risk, and then also have a slide or two here on the provincial status, because these are two important distinctions. And so I think, usually one of the conversations I have with people is, well, what status is that species? I thought it was this and I thought it was that. And sometimes it's because the same species at risk can be listed differently under different pieces of regulations and legislation. So we might see, some species of turtles, for instance, which I mentioned before, which kind of have a different situation or a different threat assessment in Ontario, for instance, versus where do they stand nationally? Those two answers might be a little bit different. Generally, the trends tend to apply. So if one species is listed as a species at risk in one region, unfortunately, often it tends to be the case in other provinces and jurisdictions as well. But that'll hopefully help clear up some of the ambiguous nature, I guess, of wait, this is listed where, what, just because there's different levels of regulation. So we're talking about species at risk at the highest of level nationally in Canada. There is the Species at Risk Act federally. And so the stated purpose that pulled straight from the legislation itself, if it seems a bit wordy, it's not my fault, but the stated purpose of the Federal Species at Risk Act in Canada is to prevent wildlife species from being extirpated or becoming extinct, and to provide for the recovery of wildlife species that are extirpated, endangered, and threatened as a result of human activity, and to manage species of special concern to prevent them from becoming endangered or threatened. And so when we take that, piece of verbiage straight from the act itself and start to put that into practice, I think what the Species at Risk Act federally starts to do is kind of as stated here, starts to give us direction on what are the threats for species, what are the processes that we can look to recover some of these species so that they can have a positive impact on broader biodiversity. And one of the really important components of the Species at Risk Act federally, in terms of outlining the process of answering is species X a species at risk, is that it creates a group called COSEWIC, and it enables this committee to of different policy experts, different perspectives. Usually it's more research and science based, but sometimes there's also policy experts in there, and a number of other kind of experts on species. It's not just from the pure academic community, if you like. So different vantage points, but people with a different perspective on how they could collect data on a certain species. And so the Species at Risk Act enables that group of people to come together and assess where is this species on that continuum? Is it an extinct, extirpated, endangered, threatened species or special concern? And make recommendations to the federal agency. So that might be Environment and Climate Change Canada, that might be Fisheries and Oceans Canada, on what is the status of this species? What does the science tell us in terms of its populations? Are they declining? Are they improving? And really importantly as well, what are the key drivers of declines if that species is declining? So what are the noted threats, the stated threats, and that are either existent currently or perhaps kind of pending threats? And so we'll put some meat on the bones in a second when we start talking about species-specific examples, but really COSEWIC is this very important group, a stakeholder group here, that can make recommendations into government and into the minister of the competent minister of each of those agencies, those federal departments, that are really critical to driving action here, whether it's Fisheries and Oceans Canada or Environment and Climate Change Canada. So that's kind of the role and function of COSEWIC, is to assess in an independent way what's going on with the species that's noted here. What are the trends in terms of its population? Are we declining or improving? Are there differences between different kind of subpopulations nationally? So we'll show a little bit more example of changes of, for instance, snapping turtle in one province versus another. Are they telling different stories, or are they telling the same story? So they can start to direct the minister and provide guidance and information to the minister and the minister's staff. So a really important role. And then what happens next? So the ministry's received some of this feedback. COSEWIC has kind of issued an opinion here on where does the species stand? What does the science tell us in terms of the population? Where is it going? And then what happens next? That's where the rubber hits the road. So we're going to, at that point, then see a government response statement. We're going to see some recovery planning happening, and we'll talk, and then we'll see some implementation. And then we've got tons of content coming up for you on kind of what do those look and feel like. So this is just kind of a quick and dirty, I guess, high-level policy on what happens nationally. And the next slide here, just to note that there is a federal policy on invasive on species at risk, and then there's also a corresponding provincial piece of policy. And provincially in Ontario, we have the Endangered Species Act, and so there's a lot of similarities between these two acts. They focus on usually different species. Again, this is an Ontario piece of legislation, so this focuses, among other differences and discrepancies between the two, so really it's just telling the Ontario specific story. because the provincial government has a really important role to kind of drive further action where the national policies might be a little bit different. And so, very much the same deal, same structure. There's a separate group, completely unrelated, called COSSARO, the Committee on the Status of Species at Risk in Ontario. And, very similar function and form in terms of who that group is comprised of, a wide array of different partners and stakeholders and other kind of interest groups that are experts in that field. So again, we've got lots of people who are experts in policy, lots of people who are experts in, perhaps fish and wildlife background, maybe in hunting or other kind of resource management fields. We've got other experts that might be species specific experts. It's not to say that there's necessarily an expert on every single species that COSSARO as a committee is going to review, but this is a committee that's comprised of a bunch of experts that know where to get the answers from in terms of that data. So they'll put out kind of public calls for information where, maybe you as a member of the public or perhaps a turtle researcher or a turtle expert, and you've got some valuable data that you can contribute to a COSSARO conversation and can contribute to informing COSSARO when they're making the recommendations. And so in terms of a process, when they're reviewing a species, they'll put out a call for a wide array of information. You can submit that information. COSSARO as a group of experts can review that and build it into their recommendations. And so same as kind of their counterparts, what COSSARO would then do is make recommendations to the province of Ontario in this case, and kind of give some information on this is where the population is headed. This is where the major threats that we perceive in the research and the literature perceives in terms of issues that are coming down the pipe. And the minister then kind of takes that report and similarly kind of produces and kind of initiates an action-oriented process. So that's COSSARO, and there's some other kind of really important things that happen through the Endangered Species Act provincially as well. As we kind of wrap up what is the policy level and policy response. This act enables the government to support a species at risk stewardship fund and a number of other funding mechanisms that give an opportunity for actions that would be within that government response, within that kind of action list. It creates funds for people who want to do, and people who want to implement, positive control or positive actions. It gives them the opportunity to do that. So there's a number of kind of funds that are available to help. Maybe it's non-government, maybe it's Indigenous communities, maybe it's school groups like yourself, to be able to kind of apply for and receive funding to be able to implement some of those actions. So whether we're talking about COSSARO or COSEWIC, what happens is once the government has taken those recommendations on where is this population or where is a species or group of populations going, and do we need to intervene in terms of creating a response and creating the kind of framework that would enable action and ultimately recovery. One of the most important things of those documents would just be a threat assessment on all of the threats that pose a potential risk to that species. And there's a wide range. Some of those recovery documents get very specific. Maybe sometimes it's a particular invasive species. We'll talk about a few examples in a little bit. But a particular species that's not here, but gosh, when it shows up, it has a devastating potential impact on that species. So, it might be as specific as that, or it might be more broad. And so I wanted to kind of talk very quickly about what are some different examples of threats that commonly show up. So each recovery document's a little bit different. It's tailored to the species at risk and how can we have a positive impact on that species at risk. But habitat loss and habitat fragmentation tend to be really common examples. So habitat loss and fragmentation. The quick and dirty version of what are those? Habitat fragmentation occurs when we're looking at parts of the habitat that's destroyed, leaving kind of smaller pieces of non-connected areas. And this is a really important concept in wildlife and management and ecology, is just kind of building the right spaces that are connected in the right ways. It's not just about area, it's about shape and connectivity as well. And so, when we're depending on the species, and we'll talk kind of species specific examples, which will hopefully help make this a little bit more tangible. Habitat fragmentation is a really important driver, but habitat loss is critically important as well. And if we want to think about kind of biodiversity, so even bigger than species at risk, if we want to go up a level to the number of species that exist in the world at a kind of global scale. And if we wanted to protect biodiversity globally, we have to address habitat loss. It's the #1 driver of species declines or biodiversity loss globally. So if we want to have a massive impact on a massive amount of species, this is the place we need to invest our effort. So looking at habitat loss, this critically important piece. And habitat loss, the definition is natural habitat that's altered to a point where it's no longer suitable. And that can look like a wide range of different kind of scenarios. It could be just complete kind of back to basics, perhaps a really productive habitat is lost and paved over in a sense, but it could just be a less obvious example of habitat loss. It might just be a modification to the point where it's just no longer suitable to that species. So it's kind of a wide range. It sounds like it's like, let's get rid of this habitat entirely, but of course, different species thrive in different kinds of environments. So I would just say there's kind of a wide range of what habitat loss can look like. It's a very big issue that can kind of appear in different ways. So, the vast majority, of course, of habitat loss is human driven, but there's also kind of, more natural. I think it's reasonable to state as well that we can see kind of natural examples of habitat loss or habitat modification happening as well. So it's not just human activity, although, of course, that is by far the most common occurrence of habitat loss. And just want to make note that these kind of two ideas here are intertwined. That habitat loss can be habitat fragmentation as well, and that these two ideas are really important. So we have, conservation authorities and municipalities all across Ontario that are working to develop maybe more robust natural heritage strategies, and essentially trying to answer the question: how connected are our natural spaces? As important as having pristine and productive and very habitat friendly spaces is, also their connectivity is vitally important as well. So we need to find the opportunities to connect these. So a lot of great work happening there on the natural heritage front. There's lots of threats out there. So, aside from fragmentation, habitat loss, just wanted to note pollution and contaminant introduction is a really important piece as well. And again, it's in terms of its linkage into species at risk, ecology, and kind of what are those recovery reaction strategies going to look like? It depends. This doesn't apply to necessarily every species. Some species literally only have one obscure but really poignant threat. So we'll talk about that, a good example in just a couple slides here. But pollution and contaminants, it does tend to be a very broad one. So we do see it fairly frequently listed within recovery strategies and recovery documents here. And it can look like different things. I think just, again, depends on the species specific. More often than not, this tends to be found as an item within aquatic species at risk recovery documents, just by kind of the nature of the issue more than anything. But it's really important. It's vitally important as well, similar to habitat loss. And the last kind of, usual suspect, I guess, in terms of threats that we'd see, I wanted to note was invasive species. And as I say, I put on my kind of day hat here. This is my area of expertise in a lot of ways, but I just want to note, before I said, kind of one really important fact to take away there is, biodiversity loss globally. What are the big drivers behind it? #1 is habitat loss. Who is #2? Unfortunately, it's invasive species. And, kind of a similar thread here and theme you're seeing is that, not all species at risk recovery documents list invasive species. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but they are kind of an important common element in a lot of them. And the other thing I wanted to note too here is that it depends on the species. So sometimes you'll see invasive species pop up, not by name necessarily, not by a specific invasive species in a recovery document. Sometimes you might see more as a pathway. So, for instance, there's a number of fish in the Canadian prairies in Western Canada, species at risk fish, that are threatened by the wording might be something along the lines of the introduction of pets and other organisms in trade. So people releasing goldfish having a negative impact on a species at risk fish. So sometimes we see it listed that way, may or may not include a specific invasive species by name. Sometimes it's just by issue or just by pathway. There's no kind of commonality or kind of common approach, I guess, in terms of listing the threat. Sometimes you just kind of need to know it based on the species at risk specifically. And another presentation for another day, but what is a species at risk? Or sorry, pardon me, what is an invasive species? The quick and dirty definition here is a species that's extending its range, so moving to a new geography from a place that for, evolutionary periods of time, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, it is called a certain geography where home, and then human mediated movement of that species to a new area. So we've taken garlic mustard, which is a wildflower in Europe, and we've brought that here to North America, to Ontario forests, and it's thrived here. So back in its home range, generally it's not invasive there. It's just a native species that you might see some garlic mustard here, a couple plants here, a couple plants there. They're not out competing native species. They're not causing negative impacts on biodiversity. They're not out competing their species at risk there. But here we do tend to see that kind of situation. So that's an invasive species where we've moved a species from one geography to another, and it's had a negative impact in some context in its new invaded range. That might be like a negative biodiversity impact or ecological impact. That might be a negative impact on the economy. It's very costly. It's impacting crop values or crop productivity or something like that, which is costly to manage. Or it might just be negatively impacting us in terms of our social use of the space. So we're no longer able to kind of swim or get our boat into that dock because an invasive aquatic plant has outcompeted the water column there. So that's invasive species 101. More in another conversation. So I wanted to throw some species-specific examples. Thank you for hanging in there so far. So we've talked about federal policy. We've talked about species at risk policy at a provincial level, the Endangered Species Act in Ontario. And we've talked about some kind of usual suspects in terms of what are the threats. Let's park that aside. That part of the webinar is done. Let's talk about species-specific examples, because that's really where I think this comes to life. And the other thing I just kind of note about the topic, I kind of noted it off the front here, is that we're going to talk about like a wide range of species with a wide range of experts who know a whole lot more about each of these species individually than any one person. So what I'm trying to do here is take a bunch of species that have various research experts, policy experts from all across Canada, put them all into one place and show some common themes to you. Whether we're talking about native mussels and how do we recover those species at risk, which are important parts of aquatic biodiversity, or if we're talking about native trees that are important to Ontario's deciduous forests and everything in between. So a wide taxonomic range. There's no one expert that can speak to it all perfectly. So just hoping to present to you today kind of the common themes that you can see the connections between, from this issue of species at risk point of view. So we're talking about mussels. There's a group of mussels, zebra mussels, unfortunately, quagga mussels are the most common mussels that you're going to find in most spaces in Ontario. But there's a wide range of native mussels which have thrived, for a long period of time. And a couple native mussels, generally when we're looking at species at risk and recovery documents for mussels, they tend to be really similar. Like if a particular threat is causing a decrease in population size in one native mussel species, probably the same threat that's impacting a wide range. They all kind of act in very similar ways. And so some examples of native mussels that are federally listed as species at risk would be lilliput, which you can find if you're in kind of central and southern Ontario. If you're out in Lake Ontario or near Hamilton, you're going to be able to find lilliput. It's a native mussel, or you can find the well-named maple leaf mussel too. A bit of a smaller mussel in terms of coming across it, but they're native mussels that you'd find in freshwater systems like all across Ontario. And unfortunately, the invasive species are one of the most notable threats here to them are invasive species. And the big species that are driving species loss of those two species of native mussel I mentioned, lilliput and maple leaf, are zebra mussels and quagga mussels. And zebra mussels especially have been in Ontario for almost 2 decades, and their spread is wide. As far northwest as we can go in Ontario, so on Lake of the Woods, which is on the Manitoba, right near the Manitoba and Ontario border, or Shoal Lake. That's our farthest north and west example of where mussels have been detected, or at least the baby mussels, veligers, have been detected, and all the way as far east as basically the Ontario and Quebec border. They haven't found their way necessarily, by all means, to every lake in Ontario. There's a lot of landlocked lakes or lakes that aren't connected. So if you think of like the Rideau system or the Trent Severn Waterway or other systems of lakes that are connected, which are important for spread of invasive species. Zebra mussels and quagga mussels haven't found themselves to some of those farther afield inland lakes yet, but they are in the Great Lakes system, so that gives them an opportunity to spread quite widely. And in terms of those being the threat, so if we think back to kind of the perspective of the species at risk, those native mussels, lilliput and maple leaf, where are we going to find those? At the bottoms of lakes, varying depths depending on which species we're talking about, or other native mussel species as well. But any freshwater system, we could find some species tailoring themselves more to river streams or riverine systems. Or if we're looking at kind of deeper lake systems as well, we can find a number of native mussels. And usually we're looking for the kinds of condition there of fairly good water quality and habitat. And that's a kind of important threat beyond those invasive species, but just the idea of eutrophication, which is adding nutrients into water bodies and polluting them in that sense. So there's different threats at play here. Anyways, mussels and native mussels are a really important kind of group of species because they're very sensitive to changes, and a wide range of them, 65% of freshwater mussels at a North American level, are at risk of extinction. So they're really, there's a bunch of things that are negatively impacting them. It's not just zebra and quagga mussels and other invasive species. It really is kind of a wide array of threats here. And all of these coming together to have a really challenging situation for these native mussels. The important thing about mussels, and there's a cool app called, I think it's called Mussel Finder, and but the important thing here about mussels and native mussels is that they're really important indicators of good overall health. They're the canary in the coal mine, if you will. So if we're interested in kind of broader ecosystem health monitoring, they're a great set of species to start with in terms of telling you how healthy is this? And if we're thinking about how can we positively impact a system and kind of work towards recovery and restoration on like a watershed scale, there are really important indicator species we can start to be monitoring for that would tell us stories about how impactful are our efforts on restoring a system. So I said before just about how there's a wide range of threats to these species, and I just wanted to give you an example here of what does one of these tables, these threat assessment tables, look like. So this is just from the lilliput, but I think it's like I said before, most native mussels tend to be subject to similar factors. And so with this particularly scope document here from 2014, it does is it's just looking at lilliput, but it's looking at lilliput in different systems here. So in the first column here, we've got all the different threats, invasive species being one. I just want to make the point here that, not necessarily every threat is the same across the board. So we have different populations of lilliput in different river systems across Ontario here. And so, the story kind of changes. Sometimes you get the same answer in terms of all across the board, contaminants and toxic substances being an important driver of lilliput declines. But sometimes we get slightly different systems. Maybe an invasive species is not being found in one system, but for instance, it's found in a number of other systems. So, the stories kind of change. So I guess that kind of speaks to some of the more locally important factors driving what our species at risk response is. Okay. I think we've talked about zebra mussels enough, but just in terms of what they do, zebra mussels and quagga mussels can be found at different depths, which is another kind of important factor here. So one species of invasive mussels, zebra mussels, for instance, being found at more shallow parts of the water column, not all the way to the great depths that you might find a quagga mussel, might kind of line up and interlink, more importantly, with one particular native mussel species that's at risk. So you kind of have to know the threat as well as possible. And by ultimately addressing the threat, we can see positive recovery from there. Okay, let's talk about a fish, lake sturgeon. Really, really interesting case study here. So currently listed as endangered from a provincial perspective in Ontario, and its last assessment in Ontario was a few years ago in 2017. So it's, that's pretty common to see an assessment period go that long. In terms of the story behind lake sturgeon, there's lots of different important drivers. If we looked at the threat assessment table for lake sturgeon, we'd see a number of things. And I think some of the most important things we'd see would be things like habitat alteration or habitat loss. So, where they're important spawning grounds and important critical habitat for these species. would be found are, the kinds of systems that are also a threat to other pollutants or habitat loss. So there's a kind of a wide range of things that are happening here, but similar to their native mussel counterparts, which we spoke about a minute ago, high levels of contaminants and pollutants are really important to the story behind the lake sturgeon loss in Ontario. And I think it's an interesting example here of a species because it's got different levels of classification based on population. So it's a wide-ranging species that historically it's got a very wide geographic range in Ontario, for most parts of the province. And all of those populations aren't quite at the same stage right now. So if we think about the southern Hudson Bay and James Bay population, we see that listed as special concern, whereas the other two populations listed at the bottom there are threatened. So again, kind of a good kind of case in point example of just kind of, species at risk is something that happens locally, even though it sounds like a very high level, national or provincial scale issue. The stories and threats and kind of current population statuses really do widely range. So if we want to tell the story, I guess, I think one of the important things here is that historically there's a lot of very big issues, water quality degradation, eutrophication, even like physical barriers. Those are really important to the story of why have we lost so many of this fish species. But one of the ones I wanted to highlight here just is another invasive species interaction here. And so we're looking at sea lamprey being it. So this is the sea lamprey over on the right side here. It attaches to a wide range of fish. So, it's kind of something that impacts a number of species, and you can see the interaction between sea lamprey and other species, not just sturgeon. But basically what they do here, if you've never seen one, is they've got these suckers on their mouth. They will latch on and not let go. So they're a parasite. They will wound or kill, more likely, the host species, and basically just hang on for dear life for, a long time, months and months and months, and just kind of suction cup onto the body of the fish and give it a very slow negative outcome. So this is what it looks like here. They can grab onto you or me. I've had them on my hand before, and it's me and my friends are able to yank them off, so that's okay and that's helpful. But this is a good example of an invasive species that once has become established, in terms of eradication, it's really not an option. It is so widely established through the entire Great Lakes systems that removing these species entirely is really not a realistic outcome here. So it's been a very costly management program, but absolutely effective because the Great Lakes fishery in Ontario is worth $7 billion. $7 billion of positive economic impact for the native fish that are harvested from all of the Great Lakes. It's really important to throw everything we can at managing this massive threat to fish production here. So there's a number of kind of chemical pheromone release and control programs that are happening led by a number of agencies, including the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. And so just wanted to note that is that like sometimes these are established and threats that will continue into the future. And so sometimes eliminating the threat outright is not possible, but mitigating or reducing the threat, I guess, is a possible outcome. So that's kind of a note of hope, I should say, for recovery there. So if we go from the water to the land here, I just wanted to note blue ash. It's a threatened species provincially regulated in Ontario in 2016. And, blue ash is doing fine. It had been doing fine until an invasive species called the emerald ash borer popped up. And so there's 56 sites at last count in southwestern Ontario. It's a Carolinian species. And who's the perpetrator here? It's emerald ash borer, which has a negative impact on all ash trees, including blue ash. And so in the interest of time, I'll kind of go quickly through this one, but basically emerald ash borer first showed up in 2002 and has negatively impacted ash all across the province. Since then, it's been found in Thunder Bay and west into Manitoba in Canada. So it's really kind of widely distributed and widely established, and it negatively impacts a wide range of species, including blue ash, which again is that provincially at-risk species, but a wide range of other ash trees as well that aren't listed as species at risk, at least currently. All right. So we've talked aquatics, we've talked about trees. let's talk about turtles. And there's 7 species of turtles that I wanted to kind of touch on quickly. And so some of these will talk species specific, but I just want to think of turtles as one large group, unfortunately, all provincially at risk in Ontario. And, what are the threats to turtles? I kind of spoke about invasive species a lot. I'm going to keep away from invasive species. There's a number of threats that do negatively impact Ontario's turtles. Habitat loss and fragmentation is a really important piece. If we could just choose one as one that we could eliminate, road mortality is the number one, is the biggest threat to native turtles, including Blandings turtles in Ontario. And a couple other important ones here that are probably not as impactful as road mortality, but still really important. So accidental or kind of bycatch. So you're out there fishing and you accidentally hook a turtle. That's a thing that happens. Or boating mortality that you might not even notice. We see poaching happening, especially of things like wood turtles in Ontario. Predation, sometimes by species that are a little more common, like raccoons, because of human-driven changes. And disease is becoming a little bit of a bigger one. So, I'd throw that into the invasive species category. Ranavirus is a new disease that's impacting potentially turtle species in Ontario. So let's talk about how are you designated as a species. Designated in Ontario, basically every turtle species except painted turtle currently. So painted turtle is there's 2 subspecies. We've got Midland and we've got Western, or you kind of just usually casually call them painted turtles as a group. They're not listed in Ontario. We have the northern map turtle, eastern musk turtle, snapping turtle, Blandings turtle, spiny softshell, spotted, and wood. All at kind of different stages of the game in terms of their species at risk designation in Ontario, and similarly different statuses if we think about federal policy too. So how are they regulated? Might be different again. So I pulled these slides from the Ontario Turtle Conservation Centre, and I just wanted to kind of speak to them because I think if we think about before, talked a little bit about how do we mitigate some of those threats, but I think this is the best kind of hands-on example I can come to breathe some more life into this topic for you. So what does the Turtle Center do? A lot of their hospital work where they intake injured turtles, fix them up and get them ready for re-release. They have a hatchling head starting program, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, and some education and kind of fieldwork component programs too, which ultimately all positively impact native species turtle and turtle recovery. So species at risk recovery. All these things are interlaced and interwoven here. So speaking about them individually is not going to tell you the right version of the story. So I just wanted to note here, we've kind of got some time limitations, so we'll go quickly through here. Let's talk about turtles. So what does the hospital look like? This is just a model. Usually there'd be another turtle there, but we have actually usually 4 vets at the Turtle Center, which are accredited vets that work for the center. And basically, if somebody sees an injured turtle, they're able to either they themselves bring into the Turtle Center in Peterborough, or through a kind of volunteer car relay network, we're able to get that turtle from any point in Ontario to the Turtle Center in Peterborough to be rehabilitated. And eventually, if that turtle is successfully rehabilitated, it's going to find its way back to the home wetland it came from. So it's about taking usually adult turtles that are sometimes really long lived. Sometimes turtles can exceed 100 years in Ontario easily. And so they've got this funny increase in as over time, they get more reproductively fit, or they're able to reproduce at much higher levels the longer they live. So if we can, if repairing and re-releasing an adult turtle costs us, $1,000, even if you start to factor in all of these costs, it's really well worth it, because that adult turtle is so valuable in terms of reproducing itself and reproducing future offspring that can replace itself when its time eventually comes, that it's just vitally important. So this is what the hospital looks like. This is Dr. Sue Carstairs here, and a vet technician who are doing an operation here to repair this snapping turtle, quite a big one. It's probably certainly decades and decades old. And as I said before, road mortality is really the big driver. So if we can only influence positively just one, that's the space we need to spend our efforts. And unfortunately, where did the road networks line up in southern Ontario? Really nicely with where is turtle habitat and turtle populations in Ontario, and also across Canada. So if we think of the 401 highway, Canada's busiest highway, going from Windsor all the way over here to Cornwall, this really nicely, unfortunately, intersects with a lot of important turtle habitat. This is what the Turtle Center looks like in terms of operations, just to give you an understanding of once you're in and out of the operating room, what does your recovery space look like? A bunch of turtle-specific bins at a new location here. And these turtles find their way, this is kind of a joke image, but they find their way from literally all across the province. A Turtle Center, this is a poor graphic design version here, but we do not have a helicopter. But there's 1,000 people basically who are on this volunteer list, who sometimes they're professional truck drivers that are driving all across the country anyways, or other people doing it for other employment reasons. Sometimes people who just travel every weekend in the summer from point A to point B. Perhaps they're going to the cottage or the camp every week. So a wide range of people who are just actively traveling around the province. 1,000 people who sign up for an email that every a few times a day in the summer, emails are sent out saying, I have a turtle in Thunder Bay, need to find a pathway to get it to Ontario. Who's going from Thunder Bay to Peterborough, back to the Turtle Center. So this is what it actually looks like. There is no fancy helicopter, but this is what it looks like. Really good people for a volunteer basis, just trying to positively promote species at risk recovery through turtle stewardship. I've actually had a volunteer pilot, just a recreational pilot here, who has actually moved turtles for us. So they're coming in by train, plane, and automobile. And in terms of where those turtles coming from, all across Ontario and some from just outside too. But we do have over 1,500 admissions back in 2021, and that number well exceeded 1,800. Actually, I got to update that number back in 2022. So almost 2,000 turtles coming in annually, and those are adult turtles. I do have some injured turtle photos, so I just wanted to kind of give a disclaimer out there. If that's not your thing, you don't want to see that, that's okay, no judgment. So just feel free to turn away for a few minutes, keep listening. There's nothing impacting you that way, but there are some turtle pictures of injured turtles, and so you're going to see some some images that might be uncomfortable. So just want to let you know, feel free to turn away. I do want to make note, any turtle you're going to see here, as gruesome as some of their initial injuries might be, they were rehabilitated and deemed suitable for release. So these are happy news stories, but the path to their re-release might be a little bit challenging. So this is a painted turtle. It came in 2021. So that's got the ID number written on its shell there. 21 is the year, and then 030. So this was the 30th turtle that came in back in 2021. And what we can see here are a number of different ones, and this is kind of what the recovery looks like here. So sometimes they're really challenging shell injuries, but the staff always say that there's no such thing as a dead turtle, because even as challenging as some of these injuries might look, once they're patched up, they're able to be re-released. And you'll see some scarring for sure, but they're able to kind of go on and reproduce themselves, or reproduce within the population, which is really important. So a few pictures here. So this would be a Blandings turtle, which is my favorite turtle. It's got a yellow chin on it. So if you ever see a turtle with a yellow chin, you're looking at a Blandings. And this was the turtle from 2021, the 110th turtle that came into the center that year, Blandings turtle. Here's a painted turtle with a shell injury here. So again, probably, most likely a car injury as well. And this is what it looks like a little bit later, and this is what it looks like down the road for release time. So again, you're still going to see some damage and scarring, but able to go out there and find its way back into the population, have no negative impact in terms of how it uses its space. Just a couple other images here. Here is a top of the shell injury. So right below the neck, there would be the head of the turtle. And then here's another kind of shell injury. This is what it looks like once it's been, cared for initially. And then farther along with proper wound care, we're going to see it being release ready. And because snapping turtles are the only turtle that can't fit their head and arms fully within their shell in Ontario, the fact that it's lost this part of the shell probably doesn't have a negative impact in terms of its ability to interact in the same way that another turtle in the release in the wild would happen. Here's an example again. This is the head of a turtle, and I think I still have a couple more images here, but I just did want to note. So this is over here is where the eye would be, and this was actually on release and fully being healed. So he's still in the Turtle Center, but he's almost ready for release here. This is actually a functional eye, so we can see recovery happening here. And again, these turtles are able to be released back into the wild population and reproduce themselves. So really important. And again, the value of a turtle that's decades old at this point, is just vitally important because their reproductive ability, their ability to kind of reproduce themselves and contribute in a positive way to their population is going to change over time. So the older you are as a turtle, generally speaking, the better you are at being able to reproduce yourself in the population. Just a couple minutes left here. So that's about taking in adult and mature turtles and reproducing themselves within the, or repairing them and getting them back into a state of mind that would be able to release them. The Head Starting program, or supercharging some turtle babies, which is not the official name of the program, is a really important piece as well. So sometimes turtles will come in and sometimes they're not able to be saved. Usually, a lot of times, but not always, we'll see a lot of those turtles that are unfortunately mortality victims. They will be females like moving to an egg laying site. So a lot of times when adult turtles come in, we're going to find them having, being gravid, having eggs within them. And so this is an important part, I think, the positive version of the story here in terms of what an organization or an initiative like the Turtle Center can do, is they're able to remove those eggs and hatch them out. And I call it supercharged turtle babies because, just by definition, if you think, put your ecologist hat on for a second and think about stable population sizes. How many eggs would it take in order to reproduce a turtle to an 80-year-old turtle, or a turtle that would find its kind of natural end, maybe 100 or 120 years old? How many turtle eggs do you think it would take to get to that population size if the population en masse over hundreds of years was not growing or shrinking? It'd take tens of thousands of eggs to reproduce just one adult. So if we start thinking about this, really eggs are kind of a low probability opportunity. Most of these eggs would either be, if laid naturally, are, some of them are not viable. Many of those would hatch out. Most of those would be subject to predation or other kind of naturally occurring features. So obviously not every egg that's out there and laid is able to reproduce itself into an adult or even a juvenile. But if we start to think about this for a sec, can we have an opportunity for an intervention to positively offset some of the negative impacts of things like road mortality, which is the biggest threat to this group of species at risk? Absolutely. Like, we can take these eggs, raise them in ideal conditions. We can control the temperature, which can influence the sex ratio of male to female. And we can make sure that they're, by overwintering for one winter at the Turtle Center, we can release them in a size that might be able to fend off some of those natural threats, predators, at least partially. And we can release them in the right place at the right time of year that can give them the highest probability to have a positive outcome. So, although it is starting from a bit of a challenging situation of a dead turtle that's coming in, those eggs can be viable for days and days after the turtle loses its life. And if they're able to be hatched out through a program like this, we can at least start to offset some of those issues. Of course, road mortality is a big important issue that we need to tackle through other policy mechanisms. But if we're looking for one opportunity to have a positive intervention, just wanted to highlight this as an action opportunity here, even though it's kind of not necessarily truly restoring the natural dynamic. It's at least an intervention opportunity that humans have that we can be able to have a positive impact here. That's what it looks like in one case. This is what it looks like in one room, and there's multiple rooms of this happening. So there are a lot of turtles. There's 8,000 that are being incubated over the winter usually, and sometimes even more. And all of those turtles, not every single one would be hatching successfully, but the vast majority do, and they're able to be released back to mom's home wetland, which is really important in terms of bringing those turtles back to their original spaces, because mom is locally adapted to the sights and sounds and threats of that system. I just wanted to make note as I wrap up here too, in terms of education opportunities. I mean, that's really important. Usually in species at risk recovery documents, we tend to not see education necessarily being listed as a top opportunity for intervention or a threat to be addressed. But sometimes there are locally adapted education, and then for a number of species, just kind of broad education and making people more aware of what are the major threats to turtles, including road mortality, is really important. So this is a direct impact and a kind of a direct response to some of those recovery action document guidance happening there. And a couple of things I quickly wanted to plug as I wind down my turtle talk time. Just wanted to note that there's a great site. If you're in kind of the Kawartha, Peterborough area and looking for a good day trip, this is a really interesting site. Lots of kind of class tour opportunities happening here, and a new center that's being built next year that's going to be able to enable multiple classes being present on the site at the same time. So check it out. And if you can't do it, I just wanted to let you know, there's a fantastic short doc. I think it's about 14 minutes or so, so we definitely don't have the time to play it all now. But there was a short doc that was done, I think, 2017, 18, 19. Oh, thanks. Somebody just put it in the chat there. It's a not, it's like a 14-minute video, but a short doc. It's actually won at a number of international documentary film festivals. It's called Fix and Release. I think Scott Dobson is the gentleman who produced it. And it's fantastic. It covers all native turtles in Ontario. What are the threats? And specifically gives you some great images of what's happening at the Turtle Center to be able to respond to some of those. So just wanted to make note of that. Really cool opportunity. If we had the time, I'd love to share it. But if you only have 1 minute, check it out. Maybe after this, click it in the chat. And if you have like 1 minute to watch a movie, start at 9 minutes, because that starts to tell a really cool story. But the whole thing, 14 minutes of your life, very well spent. There's probably a zillion other things we can talk about today, but I'm well over time. So I just wanted to A, thank you, and B, hopefully I was able to give you a little bit more context on the wide array of species at risk and what some of those positive recovery opportunities look like. So thank you, and I will leave it there.
One question that came through that I wanted to mention, even though I know we're a little over, it was specifically, could you describe the difference between extirpated and extinct very quickly?
All about geography. Yeah, excellent question. A really important piece. So extinct, we're talking about global loss. Extirpated from a historic piece, parcel of land, province, government, federally, that a species is no longer found in. So just kind of a slight distinction there about lost entirely or lost from an area.